Get her out of here. She's touching the silverware. The voice didn't need to be loud, just sharp, just cold enough to cut through the hum of a dining room that had been quiet out of habit, not out of respect. Heads turned, some curious, others amused, but no one surprised. The woman who spoke didn't flinch as she stood, her black satin dress catching the chandelier light like armor. Her gaze was fixed on the woman at the end of the table, not as a person, but as a problem. She's the maid. Why is she standing here like she belongs? Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence around her had already drawn the line. For a moment, the only movement in the room came from the slow ripple of napkins being placed back down. Half folded, one man leaned back in his chair. A woman to his left gently moved her wineglass, as if to reclaim her space. No one asked Maria to explain herself, and no one told the woman in black to sit down. Maria simply stood, hands still holding the folded cloth napkins she'd meant to set, her eyes not on the guest but on the chair. The empty chair. At the head of the table, Charles Whitmore's chair. It was draped in soft black linen, pulled slightly askew. No one dared to fix it. No one had even touched it. Except her. She stepped forward, fingers adjusting the alignment with quiet precision, an action so small, so respectful. And yet it made the entire table feel like she had just crossed a line. She thinks she's family now, someone muttered, just because she wiped his mouth while he died. A scoff followed. Someone else gave a polite chuckle, but it was forced, brittle, like crystal under pressure. Maria straightened, and for a second, her eyes didn't look at any of them. They found the far wall above the fireplace where Charles's portrait still hung. His eyes seemed softer in paint than they ever were in person, but tonight, even that oil-stained gaze looked tired. And just beneath that painting, tucked into the side of the mantel, was the same wooden box he never let anyone touch. She remembered it, because she was the only one he ever let open it. She turned, walked away. No apology, no explanation. Have you ever been made to feel small in a room you helped build? If her silence says something to you, leave a comment, share your story, or simply follow us here at Unveiled Wealth. Because sometimes the ones they ignore are the ones holding the truth. But before she reached the door, she stopped, reached into the pocket of her apron, and pulled out a red envelope, thick, bent at the corners, its flap sealed so tightly it had wrinkled. With one smooth motion, she placed it not on the table, but directly on Charles's empty silver plate. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The sound of metal against porcelain said everything. Across the table, Linda, who hadn't spoken a word, tightened her grip on her glass and stared at the envelope as if it had grown teeth. Up above, the candle nearest to Charles's portrait flickered once, then went still, and no one knew what to say next. The hallway light buzzed faintly, flickering with age. No chandeliers here. No velvet napkins or crystal glasses, just the soft beeping of a monitor and the sterile scent of bleach and resignation. Maria sat at the edge of the hospital bed, one hand wrapped gently around Charles's weathered wrist. Not to check his pulse, she could already hear the shallow, broken rhythm of his breath. Just to remind him that someone was still there. He'd lost weight. Too much. His jaw, once firm and sharp like his voice in board meetings, had softened into sagging skin and silence. His lips parted, but the only thing that escaped was air rough, resistant, fragile. Maria dipped the cloth into warm water, wrung it quietly, and wiped his brow. She did not ask if he needed it. She never had. Charles's eyelids fluttered. His eyes didn't quite open, but his hand shifted, just slightly, as if trying to find something. Or someone. "I'm here," she whispered. "It's just me." His fingers curled over hers. A pause. A long one. Then faint, nearly inaudible, but the words came, dry, cracked, but still unmistakably him. "You've been with me longer than any of them." Maria said nothing, but her throat tightened. "They talk legacy," he rasped, "but you saw the pieces fall. You swept the floor after every mistake I made." His breathing stuttered. She leaned closer, steadying his hand against the blanket. He blinked slowly, as if dragging up strength from a place no one else had bothered to reach. You're my only true family. And with that, he closed his eyes again. Not in farewell, just in rest. Maria didn't cry. She'd already done that quietly, weeks ago, in the pantry, where no one could see, where grief didn't have to be explained. Her other hand slid into her apron pocket, touching something firm rectangular, a sealed envelope. She hadn't looked at it yet. She didn't need to. All he'd said was, "If they forget who I was, you remind them." She looked around the room. No family. No flowers. No suits or sobbing heirs. Just one chair. One woman. One promise. Outside, a car door slammed. Laughter echoed faintly from the parking lot, wine soaked and casual. Inside, Maria stood, kissed Charles's knuckles once, and stepped out of the room. Down the hall in Ruta Washun, in the direction of the house she no longer trusted, someone was already pouring something into a glass that didn't belong to them. The clink of crystal was soft, deliberate. Not a toast, just a cover. Grace moved with elegance that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore pearls that used to belong to her mother-in-law, and a smile that didn't belong to anyone at all. Her heels made no sound against the marble. That she had practiced. In the quiet of the butler's pantry, she poured 2 glasses of Chateau Margaux, one for her husband, the other for herself. Both were full-bodied. Only one had an aftertaste. From the inside pocket of her silk blazer, she slipped out a tiny amber bottle. Nothing illegal. Nothing traceable. Just a sedative. Prescribed. Technically, she stirred a single drop into the wine on the left. "He'll sleep through the meeting," she whispered to herself. Better that way. Behind her, the grandfather clock ticked twice. No one walked in. The staff knew when not to. She always made sure of that. Grace's eyes didn't flicker as she cleaned the rim of the glass with the edge of her sleeve. Perfect. Not even a smudge. She took both glasses and made her way back into the main hall. Just as her husband, Daniel, was finishing a joke that no one was really listening to, she handed him the drug glass with a smile. Soft, patient, trained. "Drink," she said sweetly. "You're overthinking everything again." He didn't question her. He never did. He sipped. She watched. Across the room, the eldest son of Charles was mid-conversation with the estate lawyer, pretending to mourn while already negotiating a revision clause. They were all actors tonight, some better than others. And at the far side of the room, Maria stood behind a candelabra, invisible to most, but not to Grace and Esson. Their eyes met for just a second. Maria didn't smile. Grace didn't blink. A war had begun, but only one of them knew the weapons had already been drawn. Later that evening, in a study filled with old books no one read anymore, voices rose behind a half-closed door. The kind of arguments that only happen when someone dies and leaves behind too much to fight over and too little love to hold anything together. The door to Charles Whitmore's study had always creaked. Tonight, it didn't. Someone had oiled the hinges, someone expecting whispers, not legacy. Inside, under the glow of the old banker's lamp, 3 of them stood in a loose circle. Peter the grandson, impatient in designer shoes. Linda the daughter, pacing with a glass of bourbon. And Richard the eldest son, who stood like he'd never stopped being the center of his own world. On the desk lay a copy of the old will, dog-eared, annotated, highlighted like a blueprint, not a memory. "It's not complicated," Peter said, arms crossed. "We keep the original version. No surprises. No sudden rewrites from a senile old man who spent too much time with the maid." Linda winced. "Don't say it like that." Why not? Richard's voice was calm, calculating. "It's true. Marissa so. He wasn't himself those last few months. And he waved vaguely. She was always around. Feeding ideas. Or guilt. He trusted her," Linda muttered. "No," Richard snapped. "He needed her. That's different." For a moment, the only sound was the slow swirl of Linda's bourbon. Then Peter leaned forward. "Look, if we let the lawyer snoop around, he might find something. If there's even a chance that old man drafted a second will with her." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Richard picked up the document from the desk, held it like a man holding proof of something holy. This version, it's clean. Predictable. He signed it years ago. No drama. No sudden charity foundations. No servants in control. Linda turned away. Her shoulders were tight, her jaw locked. She didn't speak again. Behind the wall just outside the thin crack in the door, Maria stood. Still, unseen, but not unaware. She hadn't meant to overhear. Not really. She was just walking by, with a fresh set of linen to replace the one Grace had stained earlier. But she didn't walk past. She listened. Not with shock, but with a quiet, burning clarity. These weren't grieving children. They were survivors, and they had already begun carving up the bones of a man who wasn't even cold in the ground. Later that night, when the study was empty and the hallway was quiet again, Maria stepped into the room not like an intruder, but like someone returning to sacred ground. And her eyes, almost immediately, turned to the shelf behind the desk, the one with the old globe that no one touched except Charles. The study felt different at night. Not because of the lighting, it was always dim. One lamp on the corner desk left half glowing like a memory. Not because it was empty, Maria had cleaned it dozens of times alone. But tonight, it felt like someone had taken something from the room and left everything else behind, untouched and hollow. She closed the door behind her, carefully. No sound. No one needed to know she was here. Not yet. Her shoes didn't echo on the floor. Her steps were practiced, reverent, like walking into a place of worship, not war. She didn't go to the desk. She went to the globe. It sat nestled on a mahogany shelf, wedged between two dusty volumes of maritime law and a framed photo of Charles shaking hands with someone neither of them had ever liked. The globe was old, brass-framed, with tiny cracks along the equator where Charles's fingers had worn it thin. He used to spin it when he thought. Only once had he opened it in front of her. Not everything valuable needs to be locked behind steel, he had said. Sometimes, all it needs is to be forgotten by everyone but one. Maria touched the southern hemisphere, then pushed gently. The globe creaked open with a soft click. Inside, exactly where he had left it, was the red envelope. It wasn't large, but thick, heavy even before it was opened. The wax seal on the back was still unbroken. A W pressed deep in crimson, his ring mark. She held it in both hands. No trembling, no hesitation. But she didn't open it. Not yet. Not here. Not when they were still sharpening their knives with velvet gloves. Maria looked toward the empty desk. Then the portrait above it, Charles in his prime, painted younger than he'd been in years. His eyes had always been stern, but the corners of his mouth, just barely, hinted at something else. The painter had known him better than his children, or maybe not as well as his maid. She slipped the envelope into the inside of her coat and paused. She didn't speak aloud, but the thought rang clear. If they want a war over this house, they'll have to start it without me. Then she turned off the lamp and walked out of the study, just another shadow in a house full of ghosts. Down the hallway, a pair of polished loafers moved in the opposite direction. Peter, returning from the guest wing, stopped when he saw her walking away from the study. He didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed just enough to suggest he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. And Maria had seen it too. He didn't knock. Peter Whitmore was too smooth for that. He simply appeared outside the kitchen corridor, where Maria was setting out porcelain cups for the midday tea. Didn't think anyone still made it this way, he said, flashing the kind of smile that knew how to sell things. Loose leaf. Proper temperature. Almost ceremonial. Maria didn't look up. That's how he liked it. Peter chuckled, hands in his pockets. Posture casual. Too casual. He liked you, he said, more than most of us. Probably more than he should have. Still no eye contact. He stepped closer, leaned against the edge of the counter like he belonged there. I've been thinking a lot about him, Peter continued. About his last days. The stories you must know. The things he said when no one else was around. Now Maria met his eyes. Just briefly. I remember only what he wanted remembered. It wasn't a threat. But it wasn't soft, either. Peter nodded slowly, like he'd just heard something useful. He ever mentioned changing anything near the end, like documents? Maria poured tea. He mentioned regret, she said, but not revision. He took the cup she handed him, swirling it once before sipping. She didn't sit, didn't ask questions, just watched. He finished half the cup, then stood tall again, smoothing his sleeves. If you ever want to talk, he said, really talk about what matters I'm around. Maria gave no reply. But the second he left the room, she turned toward the drawer where the envelope was hidden and slowly, instinctively, checked that it was still there. It was. But so was the feeling, the same one she used to get when a floorboard creaked in an empty hall. Like someone was watching the house now, but not to protect it. That evening, the tea set was returned to the butler's pantry clean, but with one cup still faintly smelling of citrus and something unfamiliar. Maria hadn't noticed it when she'd taken a sip. But an hour later, her stomach clenched with a pain she couldn't explain. It started as a ripple, a quiet cramp, subtle enough to ignore at first. Maria was folding napkins in the hallway linen closet when the second wave came. Sharper, deeper, as if something inside her had been wound too tight and then snapped without warning. She paused, steadying herself against the shelf. Her breath slowed. Not from age, not from nerves. This was something else. By the time she reached the back room beside the staff wing, her skin was cold, her hands slightly clammy. Her mouth tasted metallic. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of pain that demands help, but it was deliberate, designed to weaken, not destroy. She lay down on the cot in the back room, one she hadn't used in years, and let the room tilt around her. Just enough to feel helpless. Just enough to lose a few hours. And in those hours, the house moved without her. Somewhere between dusk and dinner, Peter came back. He didn't ask where she was. He didn't ask how she felt. He just waited until the hall was empty and turned the knob to her room quietly, quickly. He wore gloves, moved with the kind of calm that only comes from being too sure of oneself. He went straight to the wardrobe first, then the drawers, then beneath the bed. Nothing. Then slowly to the shelf. He opened the Bible, nothing tucked inside. Tapped on the false bottom of the jewelry box. Still nothing. He was looking for something specific, and he didn't find it. But someone saw him. Thomas, the youngest kitchen porter, had come up the stairs early to ask Maria about a stain on the winecloths. He saw Peter slip from the room, saw the gloves, saw the look. But no one listened to Thomas. Not when he tried to say something later that night. Not when he whispered, "Mr. Peter was in her room." They just smiled, shrugged. "Don't make trouble, kid." And so the moment passed. But Maria had already known. Because when she woke from the pain, still weak, still slightly spinning, she reached for the envelope and found it untouched but not unseen. Someone had lifted it, held it, then put it back just half an inch out of place. That night, as the rain tapped lightly against the window pane, Maria lit a single candle in the corner of her room and sat by it, envelope in hand, memory in motion. And in the hush of that flickering light, a voice from the past returned, quiet, frail, but undeniable. The dining room had been reset. The same table, same chandelier, same silver that Maria had polished 3 nights ago, but everything felt heavier now. Not solemn, just performative. This wasn't a tribute. This was a reading. They called it a memorial dinner, but no one wore black. Peter came in a navy suit, Grace in white satin like she was heading to a charity gala. Linda, quietest of them all, wore the same dress she'd worn to the board meeting after Charles's last hospital stay. The lawyer sat at the far end, briefcase closed, lips already pursed before any wine was served. Maria entered last. No one stood to greet her. Her name was on the list. Her chair had a card, but it was at the far edge of the table closest to the swinging door of the kitchen. Behind her, the hum of dishwashers. In front of her, linen napkins folded like they might cover a muzzle if necessary. No one looked directly at her, except Linda. Just once. Then she looked away. Maria sat. She did not remove her coat. She did not reach for the glass of water in front of her. The chair to her left remained empty intentionally. Perhaps a symbolic buffer, Or maybe just a subtle punishment for occupying space she wasn't meant to. Conversation flared and died in awkward pockets. Grace laughed at something no one found funny. Peter refreshed his own wine without offering anyone else. The lawyer cleared his throat, checking his watch even though the hour had already passed. He waited for someone to speak. No one did. Until finally, Richard leaned forward. Well, he said, let's not pretend Father would have wanted long speeches. More chuckles. Let's keep it efficient. Like he taught us. The lawyer clicked open his case, pulled out a folder with tabs and initials, and flattened a single sheet in front of him. As requested by the family, I'll be reading the version of the will last updated 6 years ago. The paper rustled like it had been waiting years to breathe again. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading the will with the stiff rhythm of a man who'd practiced it too many times for people he didn't respect. To my eldest son, Richard Whitmore, I leave the controlling shares of Whitmore Holdings. To my daughter Linda, the vineyards in Sonoma and the property in Florence. To Peter, my grandson, the Lakewood estate. Each line felt like a quiet verdict. Maria sat still. Her face gave away nothing. But her hands folded in her lap were clenched just tight enough for the veins to rise. No one at the table looked at her. Not directly, but they all felt her there. As if her presence pressed on their shoulders, not like guilt, but like an echo they hoped wouldn't grow louder. Grace finally broke the silence with a smile that gleamed just a little too long. She should be grateful we even let her sit here, she said, tilting her glass toward Maria, voice sweetened with venom. Some help forget their place the second the apron comes off. Peter chuckled. Richard didn't even blink. Linda shifted, ever so slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but nothing came. The lawyer hesitated mid-sentence. Not because the document required it, but because something about the tone in the room had shifted. He looked at Maria, briefly, then continued. Maria Alvarez, in acknowledgement of long-standing service, I leave a personal letter and an honorarium in the amount of enough to buy a new broom, Grace whispered, not softly. Maria didn't react. Not with words, but her hand moved slowly, deliberately to the strap of her bag beneath the table. The lawyer stopped. Eyes shifted. Peter leaned back, as if trying to determine whether she was about to cry or leave. She did neither. Maria lifted the flap of her bag with 2 fingers. No one noticed except Linda, who had been watching the lawyer but now turned. And saw it. Read it one, dear son, return. Heavy. And already halfway onto the tablecloth. She didn't make a sound, didn't clear her throat, didn't rise or announce herself. Maria simply reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out the envelope. Restaurant, no name on the front, no markings beyond a wax seal pressed deep with a W crest. It was the kind of red that didn't belong at a dinner table, like a warning. She placed it gently right in front of the lawyer's plate, not beside it, not under a napkin. Centered. Intentionally. The sound it made against the tablecloth was barely audible. But it was enough. Conversation stumbled. The lawyer blinked, unsure if it was a mistake or a message. Peter narrowed his eyes. Grace tilted her head like she was about to laugh, but didn't. Linda didn't move. She watched Maria with a different expression, one that held memory, not mockery. One that said she might know what that envelope was, or worse, feared that she did. Maria never looked at Peter, never looked at Grace, only Linda, and she didn't smile. She just held the gaze long enough to remind her that silence was never weakness, only strategy. The lawyer reached for the envelope, but Maria placed her fingers gently over it, halting him. Not yet, she said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken all night. No one else dared to speak again. Sometimes, the most powerful thing in the room isn't the one who talks the most. If you've ever watched someone underestimated, yet never flinched, share this story. Subscribe to Unveiled Wealth, where the quietest moments carry the loudest truth. The envelope remained unopened, but the room was already different. You could feel it in the air, the stillness before thunder. And as the lawyer finally broke the seal, something shifted behind Maria's eyes. She wasn't bracing for a reaction. She was waiting for the truth to walk in and sit at the table. The envelope lay open now. The red seal, once pristine, had been cracked with a hesitant hand, like a man unwrapping something that might burn if he touched it wrong. The lawyer pulled the contents slowly, two folded pages, aged but sharp-edged, like they'd been kept somewhere safe. His eyes scanned the first lines once, then again. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked up, then at Maria, then back at the pages. He swallowed, throat dry. I wasn't aware of a second document. Peter's chair creaked. Grace shifted. The air in the room had gone stale. "You've never seen it?" Richard asked, eyes narrowing. The lawyer shook his head. This isn't part of the file I reviewed before tonight." And yet he tapped the seal, then turned to the second page. His voice a little quieter now. "This is signed. Witness 31, Circuit de Stormina Tortu," and dated 2 months before his death. No one spoke. Even the kitchen seemed to go silent, no plates, no clatter. Just the low hum of electricity and held breath. Peter finally broke the stillness with a sharp laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." He reached across the table like he meant to take the paper, but the lawyer pulled it back before he touched it. Maria didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. Richard leaned forward now, hands clenched. "Who witnessed it?" he asked. "There has to be a witness line. A signature." The lawyer looked back down, then paused. His finger tapped a single name at the bottom of the second page. Then he said it aloud. "Maria Alvarez." Silence. Surina Warnemans. A new kind of memoir. Not awkward, not polite. This one was charged to Wildwilwisiemen Odwenschunren. Maria finally looked at the man who had just read her name like it didn't belong on paper. Then she spoke quietly, like a statement made only once. "He signed it in front of me, and he asked me to keep it safe, until you forgot what his voice sounded like." "He signed it in front of me," Maria said, her voice steady but low, like a stone dropped into still water. "And he asked me to keep it safe, until you forgot what his voice sounded like." The room froze. Grace scoffed, loudly, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That's convenient," she snapped. "It made with a legal document. Signed, Woodian hidden. Pulled out just in time for dinner." Peter pushed back his chair. Not to stand, but to make space between himself and the table, like he didn't want to be near whatever came next. "This is outrageous. We're just taking her word for it." Seriously, Maria didn't answer him. She never looked at him. Her gaze stayed on the lawyer, calm, precise. She was done explaining herself to people who only heard what served them. The lawyer spoke again, this time slower. "It's dated. It carries a signature. And by appearance, the ink is consistent with the time period." Still, he hesitated. "I'd feel more comfortable if we had a witness corroboration." "You have one," Maria replied. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You expect us to believe this is real? You stood there and watched him change his will." Just like that, Maria's eyes didn't blink. "He changed it because he didn't trust any of you anymore. And he knew none of you would believe it, unless it came with proof." Grace laughed again, too sharp, too loud. "And what? You have a video too," Maria didn't answer. She reached into her coat. This time, it wasn't paper. It was a small flash drive, black and worn, its edges taped, like it had been touched too many times by nervous fingers. She placed it next to the envelope on the table. "Play it," she said. "If you're so certain he'd never change his mind, prove me wrong." The lawyer hesitated only a moment longer before sliding the flash drive into the small laptop he brought with him. The screen blinked blue, then black. "Maid were." Then slowly, a familiar voice, frail but firm, began to speak, and the room leaned in as if the dead had returned to finish what he started. The screen flickered once, then held black for a breath too long. No music, no opening title, just the slow emergence of a man's face, pale, worn, sunken by time, but unmistakably Charles Whitmore. He sat in the chair by the window in his study, daylight behind him cutting harsh lines through his profile. His voice, when it came, wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of finality. "If you're watching this, I'm likely gone. And if this document has reached the table, It means I've made a choice some of you won't like. No one in the room moved. Charles looked straight into the lens, like he was looking directly across the table at each of them. I spent my life building things. Businesses, homes, somatisuri euro, and families. But in the last years, I've also watched some of those things rot. He paused. Not for breath, but for control. Money makes people forget who they are. Some of you have already forgotten. Peter scoffed under his breath but said nothing. Grace shifted uncomfortably, trying to feign disinterest, but her fingers gripped the stem of her glass so tightly it might snap. This revision, Charles continued, was witnessed by Maria Alvarez because I trust her to protect it better than any of you. He said her name clearly, without apology. She has no stake in my wealth, but she does have something most of you traded away for leveraged dignity. Linda looked down. Richard said nothing. Charles leaned forward in the recording. If this new will is contested, I want the contest itself to be part of my legacy so the world sees what greed does to inheritance. Then the camera jolted slightly, an old hand adjusting the tripod, and just before the footage cut out, he added one more sentence. Off script, quieter if they tear each other apart, it won't be because of the money. It'll be because they thought they deserved it. The screen went dark. No one clapped. No one blinked. For a moment, the only thing that moved was the slow drip of condensation sliding down Grace's untouched wine glass, and the lawyer, clearing his throat, gently folding the new document in front of him as if the verdict had already been read. The silence after the video was unnatural, dense, unbreathable, like the room itself had lost its balance. The lawyer sat straighter now, as though the weight of what he held in his hands had doubled. This revision, he began carefully, appears to meet all requirements of validity. The signature matches archive samples. The witness is present. The document is dated and corroborated by a direct statement from Mr. Whitmore in a recording of his own volition. Grace opened her mouth, then shut it again. Her eyes were wide, but her jaw was locked. Peter wasn't as quiet. You can't be serious. He stood, knocking over his chair with a dull thud. She's just a maid. She's not even family. This can't be binding. The lawyer didn't flinch. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of law and intent. And the intent is clear. Richard's voice broke through next, rough and brittle. Who gets what? Then the lawyer looked down. As outlined in this version, the estate is to be divided equally among 5 named individuals. Mr. Richard Whitmore, May, Linda Whitmore, a water insuranaman, Mr. Peter Whitmore, Kuntutizashari Yodawari, Marasuwasinon, Mrs. Zawar, Maria Alvarez. And he turned the page. Whitmore Foundation Trust, with Mrs. Alvarez designated as interim executor and coordinator. The room held, then cracked. Grace pushed her plate aside so hard the cutlery clattered off the edge. You're giving her control. She turned to Linda now, eyes sharp with betrayal. Are you okay with this? Linda didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Maria. But they were different now, less judgment, more recognition. Peter grabbed the second page off the table. I'll fight this. I'll have it thrown out. You can try, the lawyer said evenly. But you'll have to do it in public. Against the man's own words. His face, his voice, his last request. Peter crumpled the page in his hand but didn't throw it. He just stood there boiling quietly. Maria didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink. She simply reached for the envelope, now empty, and folded it once. Then again, like she was putting something back to rest. And for the first time in the entire evening, she finally looked around the room. At each of them, one by one, and in that glance, she didn't ask for anything, not permission, not forgiveness, not even respect. But the message was unmistakable. She wasn't here to win. She was here to finish what he started. Maria stood slowly, nodding once to the lawyer, not for show, but for duty. She picked up the folded page with her name on it and walked out of the dining room. Behind her, a storm of whispers started to form, but she never turned back. Because some roles aren't given. They're chosen in silence, long before anyone else realizes who truly held the house together. The revised will was clear. 5 names. Two were missing: Grace and Daniel, Charles's younger son. The lawyer announced it without emphasis. No drama, just ink on paper. But the sound it made in the room was louder than any scream. Peter stiffened. He knew he was safe, but not invincible. Grace stared at the table, as if by focusing hard enough, she could undo the words just spoken. Daniel leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes locked on Maria now like she was the problem to solve. "Why are we not included?" His voice was tight. Not shocked, just insulted. The lawyer answered calmly. "According to this document, Mr. Whitmore excluded both of you due to concerns about past conduct and intent to undermine the estate." Daniel's hand slammed down, not hard but sharp. "That's hearsay." Maria didn't flinch. She reached into a slim leather folder and placed two sheets on the table. Then another. "Charles asked me to keep records," she said. "Not to punish, but to protect." The first was a handwritten note, familiar slanted script. "Daniel withdrew $80,000 from the foundation fund for personal travel. Asked me not to tell Linda." 18. The second was a printed still from a hidden camera, Grace in the pantry, pouring from a small bottle into a wine glass. No one spoke. Even the lawyer looked down. Grace's mouth opened, closed, then curled into something between a laugh and a grimace. That was antihistamine. He had allergies. "I was trying to help." Maria said nothing. She didn't have to, because the date stamp on the footage was 3 days after Daniel's last meeting with Charles, when they'd been told he wouldn't last another week. Daniel stood up, walked out. No defense, no denial, just the sound of dress shoes echoing down a hallway suddenly too long. Grace stayed seated, but her face had changed. The veneer was cracked. Her hands were folded too tightly in her lap, and her shoulders had lost their sharpness. Across the table, Linda had gone pale. She hadn't touched her drink, hadn't spoken for minutes. But now, as the weight of everything finally settled, her voice returned smaller, cracked, real, not to Maria, to the room. "I think we all owe her more than we ever gave." Linda didn't move for a long time. Not when Grace sat in stunned silence. Not when Daniel's footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Her fingers trembled slightly around the edge of the tablecloth, and for the first time in this entire evening, her gaze broke from the documents and rose to meet Maria's. "I used to hate you," she said, not loudly, not for drama, just truth. "Not because you did anything wrong. You never did. I hated you because my father trusted you more than he trusted me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't wipe the tear that slipped down her cheek. "And I told myself it was because you were always here. Because you served. Because it was easy for him to confide in someone who didn't talk back. But that wasn't it. He trusted you because you listened. Because you never lied to him. Because you stayed when we didn't." No one interrupted. Grace sat frozen. Peter had gone quiet. Even the lawyer closed his folder with care, as if to give this moment space. Linda's breath shuddered in her chest. "I was cruel. Not always out loud, but in the way I looked at you. Like you didn't matter. Like you were just the maid." Maria didn't nod, didn't soften. She didn't reach across the table with forgiveness. She simply looked at her with the same clarity she had always looked at Charles. "He didn't see me as a maid," she said quietly. "He saw me as someone worth trusting." The room held its breath. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't sharp. It was just true. Linda lowered her eyes. And for the first time all night, Maria stood not to leave, not to take charge, but to reclaim the dignity that had always been hers. She looked at the others, each one of them now stripped bare in a house they once ruled. "I don't want the money," she said, voice even. "I never did. I want his wishes respected. And his name remembered for what he believed in, not what he left behind." Have you ever watched someone carry dignity like it was armor, even when the room stripped everything else away? If you've ever been judged by your role, not your worth, let us know. Because sometimes the quietest person at the table is the one who kept the whole thing standing. Outside the dining room, the night was colder now. But through the hallway windows, you could see a light coming on in the office, the one Charles used to keep locked. And inside, papers were being laid out. Not for inheritance, for foundation work, for reform, for something he believed might finally outlive his name. It started as a headline in a local business journal. Small, tucked between a piece on housing permits and a story about a museum opening. Just 8 words, but they carried the gravity of a stone dropped into still water. The maid who protected a billionaire's final wishes. No dramatic photo. No scandalous quote. Just a candid shot Maria standing beside a row of bookshelves in the Whitmore office. Her back turned slightly, a folder in hand. Unposed. Unbothered. Real? Atamanushans. But the article traveled quietly, relentlessly. By the end of the week, it had been reprinted in 3 national outlets. By the end of the month, an editorial in The Atlantic asked, would your family trust the maid more than their own blood? The conversation changed. Whispers about the scandal became curiosity about the woman. She was no longer a mystery. She was a mirror, and it rattled people. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore Foundation offices, once closed off, once reserved for gala invites and legacy board meetings, new hands were sorting old paperwork. Maria's hands. She didn't ask for the position. She didn't campaign for it. But Linda had come to her personally. Not with press, not with flowers, just a folder and a promise. He trusted you to keep the house whole. Will you help rebuild what he wanted to leave behind? Maria didn't answer right away. She'd stood in that office for a long time before she said yes. Not because she needed the title, but because she knew what it cost to keep a name clean when everyone was trying to cash in on it. So she accepted. But she kept her name off the letterhead. On the wall of the main conference room, a new plaque was mounted. It read, "In honor of the one who stayed when everyone else had somewhere more important to be." No title, no job description, just presence. Modern, and presence, finally, was enough. At the fall press conference, cameras blinked and microphones blinked red. But it wasn't a CEO or heir who stepped to the podium first. It was Linda. And for the first time, she didn't speak for the family. She spoke for the woman who had kept it from collapsing. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but by 11:30, the room was already packed. Journalists, photographers, a few old board members who hadn't shown up since Charles's last hospital stay. Some came for the name, some came for the fallout, but most came because they'd read that headline and couldn't forget it. Linda stepped to the podium not in couture, not in signature. Whitmore black. She wore a gray blouse and no jewelry. Her voice wasn't polished. It was steady. Today marks a new chapter for the Whitmore Foundation. But before we talk about the future, we have to name the reason we still have one. Cameras clicked. Not fast, not aggressive. Like they knew something was about to be said that wouldn't be repeated. There's someone here who isn't used to spotlights, who never asked for credit, but whose integrity outlasted our arrogance. Her voice wavered slightly, not from nerves, but weight. She protected my father's wishes when the rest of us were too busy protecting our assumptions. A pause. The room held. Linda turned slightly, gesturing toward the front row. Maria stood. No introduction. No fanfare. She didn't wave. She didn't bow. She simply walked to the side of the stage, nodded once, and stood beside Linda, not behind her. The backdrop read, "Legacy through trust." No one clapped. Not yet. Because something about her presence made it clear this wasn't a ceremony. It was a correction. Linda continued, quieter now. She wasn't blood. She wasn't wealthy. But she was the only one he trusted to carry forward what mattered most, not the money, but the meaning. That was when people started to applaud. Not loud, not synchronized, but real. Maria didn't speak. She didn't need to, because sometimes standing there unchanged, unwavering, is louder than any speech. That night, in the Whitmore Foundation Library, once closed to anyone without a last name, visitors gathered around a new portrait hung near the center wall. It wasn't grand. It wasn't framed in gold. Just a soft photo, Maria and Charles, seated side by side, laughing at something no one else had heard. And beneath it, etched in brass, she didn't carry his fortune. She carried his intent. The ballroom lights dimmed just enough for the stage to glow, soft and warm, not grand. This wasn't a celebration. It was a beginning. The first gala of the new Whitmore Foundation had drawn more people than anyone expected. Not because of the name, but because of the story. The one they couldn't ignore anymore. The one that had quietly challenged everyone who'd ever looked past someone who stayed in the background. Linda stood on stage not as an heiress, not as a daughter, but as a voice finally aligned with the truth. This wouldn't exist, she said, without someone we never truly saw. She didn't name her. She didn't need to, because every eye in the room had already turned. Maria sat in the first row, hands folded gently in her lap. Her dress was simple, her posture calm. She didn't shift in her seat when they looked at her. She didn't smile to soften the attention. She simply allowed herself to be seen for the first time, fully, without a tray in her hand or a title beneath her name. And then something rare happened. Before the applause started, before Linda continued, one person stood up, then another, then the entire room. Not for a speech, for presence. As stewards were, the cameras didn't zoom in, but one of them panned left just enough to catch a small glass frame mounted on the side wall of the stage. Inside it, preserved under low light, was a folded letter in Charles Whitmore's handwriting. The last line visible beneath the signature read, "If you ever lose the house, follow the woman who kept it standing." She never demanded a seat at the table. She simply built the table and waited until they noticed. Have you ever underestimated someone just because of their job title? If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts. Someone out there may need to be seen.